Welcome back, folks, to another Archetype review. My name is Frizz, and today we're going to be going over the unexpected Sharpshooter archetype from the recently released Guns and Gears. Unexpected Sharpshooter is a somewhat silly archetype with some incredibly strong mechanics, and I love everything about it. It allows for a character to be so lucky that they look skilled, or so skilled that they look lucky. It's entirely up to you which camp your character falls into, and it's entirely possible that they fit into both or neither depending on the day or how they're feeling, or how you're feeling really. It's Schrodinger's skill. It also has some really interesting abilities that are based off of Deception, so I highly suggest that you're at least trained in it. Also, Deception is a very flavorful skill if your character is only pretending to be lucky. It's an uncommon archetype, so if your GM feels like it's either too powerful or clashes too much with the tone of the game, they can say that you can't take it. For archetypes like this, I completely understand why it's uncommon, and I feel it's really justified, especially considering how some campaigns and settings don't even have guns. Although if your GM is saying that you can't use this archetype because it is a gun-based archetype, you can actually use almost all of the feats with all ranged weapons, not just firearms. There are only a couple of feats that are restricted to firearms and or crossbows, so you can get almost everything out of this archetype without having to use a firearm. You can even use, like, throwing knives. Let's jump right into things, shall we? This archetype becomes available at level 2, and it comes out of the gate really strong. That dedication only gives you one ability, Accidental Shot. Once per day, you can spend 2 actions to strike with a ranged weapon, rolling twice and taking the better on both the attack roll and the damage roll as you trip or stumble whenever you attack. It looks like it shouldn't work, but it actually works incredibly well. This attack also ignores any circumstance penalties to your attack rolls, and any flat checks that are required due to the target being concealed or hidden. This is very, very strong. Being able to roll twice and take the better comes out to being approximately a +5 on your attack roll, and +5 is an absurd bonus in Pathfinder 2e, and it greatly increases your chance of critically hitting. Also, being able to ignore concealment and hidden is always going to be useful, because there are a lot of effects that apply concealment and hidden. All of these benefits are balanced out, though, by only being able to use this ability once per day. But as we see later, there are some ways that you can get around to using this ability a bit more often. Hit the Dirt is a level 1 gunslinger feat that you can take at level 4 through the unexpected Sharpshooter archetype. If you're already a gunslinger, I can't really recommend that you take this at level 4, because if you want it, you should just take it at level 1, because it is a level 1 class feat, and I feel like it's much more worth a level 1 class feat than a level 4 class feat. It can be very useful though. It's a reaction that triggers whenever a creature that you can see attempts to ranged strike against you. As a reaction, you can leap away, moving probably 10 or 15 feet, getting a +2 circumstance bonus against the attack, and whenever you land prone. This can help you dive into cover to avoid any further attacks. It is alright, and it can save your life when it comes down to it, but being prone does put you at risk from further attacks if you aren't behind cover though, as you're now flat-footed. Also, you're probably going to have to stand up when it gets to your turn, so it'll probably eat an action then. It's great in dire situations, or to reposition into a place that you will be wanting to stay for a long period of time. Lucky Escape is another defensive reaction that you can take at level 4, and it's considerably more powerful, if a bit more limited. What I mean by it being limited is that you can only use it once per day, but it is very strong, and I mean that. It triggers if you are targeted by an attack, even if you are not aware of that attack, and then you can force the person attacking you to roll twice and take the worse, as you just so happen to lean down to grab something off of the floor, or just roll over in your sleep even if you aren't aware of the attack. Similarly to rolling twice and taking the better result, the misfortune trait, which is rolling twice and taking the worse, is very, very powerful. It is approximately a -5 on the attack roll, which greatly increases the chance of it missing you. It is limited to once per day though, so it isn't overwhelmingly powerful, but just like with Accidental Shot, there is a way to get around this. Risky Reload is another 4th level feat that you can take that is also a gunslinger feat, although gunslingers can get it at level 2 rather than 4. It allows you to spend one action to reload your firearm, and then immediately strike with it. If you miss the strike, then your gun misfires, meaning that you have to spend an action to clear it out. It also has the flourish trait, meaning that it does restrict your options a bit if you have other actions with the flourish trait that you want to use. If you aren't worried about those problems though, then this is an incredibly powerful feat that makes using guns a lot less action intensive. One of the big issues with using firearms is how reloading takes up your actions, and you could be using those actions for other more valuable things. Risky reload just says, okay, let's give a little bit of a failure effect, but otherwise you can really reduce the amount of actions that you have to use to reload. Also, it isn't even all that risky if you're either a fighter or a gunslinger, since you aren't all that likely to miss if you're doing this with your first shot. Also, it's important to remember that this only works with firearms, so if you're not using a firearm, you don't really have a reason to take this feat. At level 6, unexpected sharpshooters get access to one of the only ways to deal non-lethal damage with all ranged weapons that I can think of: the feat No Hard Feelings. It's really quite simple, as it just allows you to give any strike with a ranged weapon the non-lethal trait, meaning that you do non-lethal damage rather than lethal damage. This is great for people who want to be a bit less lethal, or for bounty hunters or other adventurers that want to take people alive. Normally trying to do that means that you take a -2 penalty on your attack rolls, which can make fights substantially harder. No Hard Feelings means that you can be just as effective taking people alive, even if it's quote-unquote by accident because you're just lucky, but it works, and it is really interesting and creates an interesting idea for a character of this person who really tries to not leave a path of bodies behind them, just a path of unconscious bodies. That was a close one, huh? Is the only skill feat in the Unexpected Sharpshooter archetype, and it can be pretty useful. It requires that you're a master in deception, and allows for you to spend an action after either use Accidental Shot and hit, or use Lucky Escape and the triggering attack misses. When you spend that action, you can attempt to demoralize the target of Accidental Shot or Lucky Escape using Deception, as your complete seeming disregard for the danger you're in or the danger you create leaves your enemy's resolve shaken. Something to keep in mind is that at this level, you can only use this feat a maximum of 2 times a day, as both Accidental Shot and Lucky Escape are limited to once per day. It is pretty strong though, as Demoralize is a very strong action, and being able to use Deception instead of Intimidate is a nice bonus, because it means you don't actually have to focus on both being deceptive and intimidating. By the time that you get to level 8, you might have been a bit tired of only being able to be stupidly lucky once per day whenever you're striking. Now though, you can be lucky once per hour instead. If you take the Unbelievable Luck feat, you can now use the Accidental Shot action once per hour rather than once per day. This makes it a lot more useful, as now you'll be able to use it multiple times per day, and depending on how your party spends their time, you might even be able to use it way more. If your party likes to spend a lot of time healing up between fights, then there's a good chance you might only have a fight once per hour, but that might be situationally dependent. Now you don't have to wait for the quote-unquote perfect time to use it. You can just use it with a lot less stress and tension, because you can get it again on that day. Being able to roll twice and take the better on an attack roll once per day is already good, but being able to do it once per hour is somehow even better. The I meant to do that feat at level 10 is very unusual. It requires that you're trained in deception, but it allows you to, once per hour, spend an action after you miss with a ranged weapon to attempt a shove, trip, or disarm against the opponent that you missed, using Deception instead of Athletics. You do this by having your projectile ricochet somewhere, forcing the target to trip or stumble out of the way of the projectile. This is just weird, since there are hardly any ways to perform these actions at range, let alone with a charisma skill. This is quite strong, since all of these actions can be very useful and in certain scenarios can be fight-defining, like, shove whenever there's a cliff nearby. Do keep in mind though that these attacks will be at a multiple attack penalty, so critically succeeding isn't actually that likely. This matters a lot for disarm. because disarming someone requires a critical success to actually get the item out of their hands. Regardless of that, this feat is very, very useful. Trickshot is the final gunslinger feat that you get access to as an unarmed sharpshooter. It isn't all that complicated, though it only works with crossbows or firearms, so you can't use this for a bow or any other ranged weapon like you can for most of the other feats in this archetype. It allows you to spend 2 actions to strike against an object near an enemy, setting the AC as the easy DC for your level, so you're very likely to hit. If you hit, then you can generate one of 2 different effects. First, if it's an unattended object, you can move it 10 feet in a direction of your choice. The second effect is if you hit a volatile object that is prone to exploding, you can cause it to explode, dealing 66 damage of the GM's damage type of choice in a 20-foot burst. So if it's like a lantern or some explosive stuff, it's probably going to be fire, but if it's like a vat of acid, it might do acid damage instead. Everyone in that 20-foot burst gets a basic reflex save versus your class DC to reduce the damage. But regardless of that, this is a great way to be able to deal damage in an area if you don't have a way to do one otherwise. Most martial classes don't have a great way to deal damage in a large area, and this gives you a decent way to do that. The damage also does increase as you level up. My main issue with this feat is, for how high level it is, it's very, very situational. Most enemies will have their important combat items on them, so they won't be valid targets for dislodging those items. And the situations where you're going to be in combat where dislodging and moving around unattended items is going to be pretty uncommon. For volatile objects, there might just be a chance that there are no volatile objects near groups of enemies. This isn't a first-person shooter, so there aren't going to be explosive barrels everywhere. Whenever it does come up, it can be useful, but it's probably not going to be coming up very much, if at all. Also at level 10, you can upgrade Lucky Escape to be able to be used once per hour with the Unbelievable Escape feat. I'm not going to be spending all too much time talking about this, since I already talked about Lucky Escape long enough. It was already very useful. Being able to use it once per hour instead of once per day is obviously going to make it much, much more useful. Now, let's move on to a much more complicated feat that is also very, very interesting. The capstone of this archetype is Chain Reaction, and it comes online at level 12, but it honestly feels like a much, much higher level feat. You can spend all 3 of your actions in a turn to make a ranged strike. On a hit, you can then make another ranged strike against a different target that is within 30 feet of your original target. If that hits, then you can make another strike against a different target within 30 feet of the second target. You can then do this over and over and over and over again until you eventually miss someone. You can't target the same creature more than once, but you can do a lot of damage with this. Once you finally miss someone, you then roll damage for every single creature that you hit, and you deal that damage to them. Keep in mind that this is reined in a little bit by how your multiple attack penalty does increase with every successive shot, so it might not be as useful against higher level enemies. Where the real fun of this feat kicks in is how you get to flavor this chain reaction of destruction. It's normally some kind of improbable event, like, let's just give a quick example. You shoot someone with a gun, and the bullet ricochets off and hits a lantern that's hanging above someone else's head, which causes the oil to spill out on top of them, burning them. They then accidentally knock over a table, which slams into someone's knees, hurting them, and then they accidentally lash out and stab their buddy with their spear. The damage type that you do to each individual depends on how you describe them getting hurt. For example, that guy that got hit by a bunch of oil might take fire damage, while the guy getting stabbed by a spear would probably take piercing damage. You can go completely crazy with this and create the Rube Goldberg machine of your dreams, as long as it's deadly. Also, you can do this every 10 minutes. It's not a once per day thing. This isn't actually all that overpowered though, especially if you're going to be fighting enemies of your level or higher, since once you've hit a couple of people, your actually will be reduced so much by your multiple attack penalty that you aren't all that likely to get super lengthy chain reactions. That doesn't get too much in the way of how stupid and fun this ability is, though. It's basically built for comedy, while also being a really interesting mechanic, and I adore it. This is easily the craziest archetype that I have covered on this channel, and I love everything about it. I personally feel like it has the perfect amount of zany action for most Pathfinder games where it won't stand out all that much, while also having some very interesting abilities. Whenever I finally get around to playing a gunslinger, which is at this point probably going to be in a year or two, I'm probably going to be playing an unexpected sharpshooter. It's just a very fun trope and archetype, and I feel like you can do a lot of storytelling with it. Thanks so much for getting to the end of this video. This has been a really fun one to make, and I'm really looking forward to going over more content from Guns and Gears and Grand Bazaar. Both books are a ton of fun to read through, and the stuff they included in them is just fantastic. If you don't mind, I would really appreciate a like on the video and a comment down below on pretty much anything you want to talk about. If you want to see what I'll be putting out next, then subscribing will tell the YouTube overlords above to recommend it to you. I'll hopefully see you next week, but until then, live a wonderful life.